Dallas and from here in Encino and from West Hills and Woodland Hills and even from Berkeley and as far away as West LA. So that's really nice to have, and the Galus of Century City. So it's nice to see folks here from all over. And again, I'm Rabbi Noah Farkas. I work at Valley Beth Shalom. And it's just really nice to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and put the speaker view on. Let's begin tonight, as we do in all of my classes when we learn Torah together. If you know the blessing, go ahead and say it with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, who enriches our lives with the mitzvot and occupies us with the study of Torah. Amen. And so I'm going to not manage the mute too much, but if you are, in proper Zoom fashion, if you'd like to mute yourself, that would be helpful to all of us. And then if you have a question, either just use the raise hand function or, go ahead and shout out something and maybe you'll get my attention. So tonight is Shavuot, and we're having dinner with my kids, and we were talking about all the different names of Shavuot. So one of them is called Chag HaBikorim, which is the holiday when we bring the first fruits to the temple. So spring harvest is in its fullness, and you bring the very first parts of those harvests, whether it's fruit or barley or wheat, and you bring them to the temple. And in a sense, it's Jewish tax day. It's like when everyone brings in the food, and or they bring in money, the equivalent of the food, and that pays for the whole governing system. That's how it used to work. That's Chag HaBikorim. It's called Chag HaShavuot because tonight is the 50th night since the second night of Passover. And before I get into the text I'm going to study, I do have to say that 50 nights ago, we were at the near beginning of this pandemic, and it's starting to feel like a long time now when you reflect on it. That nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. The idea that we were going to have Seders at home for the first time. I mean, the pandemic really kind of hit hard about a week after Purim, which was only about 2 weeks before Passover. So 50 nights ago, we were sitting around our second Seder, and we weren't sure what was going to happen or how bad it was going to get. And here we are 50 nights later, and we've learned so much about ourselves and about each other, about this disease. And even though that the future is still almost as equally uncertain as it was 50 nights ago, one thing we did learn is that despite our distances, we can still be together. And we're starting to figure that out. And that the fact that all of you are here also is a testament that this project we call Judaism and the covenant is a vital project no matter where you are in the world, and no matter what your circumstances, and no matter how challenging it seems. The questions, the immortal questions, the ever-present questions of how to live, how to be together, how to be a Jew, how to be a father, a mother, a sister, a brother, a son, a daughter, spouse, community member, those questions never go away, and Judaism always has the answers. And so if I've learned anything about this, is that we know then that Jewish life is resilient. And we knew that already, but I think this pandemic, after 50 nights, is teaching us something new. It's a new form of revelation. What I want to do tonight is to talk about Jewish power. Jewish power is always an uncomfortable subject because anti-Semites use the idea of Jewish power against us. We're either not powerful enough, therefore we can be the victims of anti-Semitism, or in their mind too powerful so we can be the victims of anti-Semitism. And when we talk about what power actually means, when we talk about when we talk about what power actually means, there are so many different definitions, but we're uncomfortable with the notion of Jewish power, and we've been uncomfortable with the notion of Jewish power for thousands of years. And what we're going to do tonight is take a little bit of a journey through the history of Jewish power, utilizing a series of texts that show how power has changed and shifted, and then the question of how do we relate to Jewish power today in a very unique time, perhaps the most unique in the history of the Jewish community. This text study that I'm doing tonight, I teach often to the Rautenberg New Leaders Project, which is a group of up-and-coming civic leaders that are training to become leaders. And their very first experience with me is a retreat up at Brandeis Bardeen, although I guess not happening at this point. And we have this study session where we bring up the topics of Jewish power and what it means to be a Jew who's powerful, or the nature of Jewish power. So this is meant to be a little bit interactive. So if you have questions, again, feel free to start raising them and ask me questions. When you think about what it means to have Jewish power, the question that's on the table is, why does it make us feel just so darn uncomfortable? Why is it that we just get so uncomfortable with the notion of Jewish power?
You know what? I'm not going to bother.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if you want these texts at the end of the night, I am very, very, very happy to share them with you, email them to you, and send them to you. Just let me know, okay? So it's funny because these texts I've taught for many years, and Rabbi Bassin, who's on the call with us, and I are in this fellowship that's kind of discovering power. And some of the texts are repetitive from that fellowship, Rabbi, but that's because these are the texts. And so it's really nice to see how they come up differently. If you want to think about Jewish power, I want to begin at the beginning.
All right. Anyway, I just wanted to ask.
I want to begin at the place where we all... I want to begin at the place where we think about the last time that we were powerful as a Jewish community, and that was before the fall of the temple. And Jeremiah is the best prophet to exhibit what it means to be powerful and how to lose power. And so just the historical context here very quickly is that Jeremiah was a prophet. He was considered essentially one of the last of the prophets before the fall of the temple. And he was the one who saw the writing on the wall that the Jews were going to lose physical power. We're going to lose coercive power, the ability to use violence to force the situation to what we wanted. And it's because when we often think of power, we associate it with monopoly of violence, the ability to use physical force to sort of push your will. And states, governments, as Max Weber, the sociologist, says, they have the monopoly of violence. They're the ones who are able to arrest people. They're able to raise armies. And because of that, that's a physical power. And Jeremiah was the prophet who saw the end of Jewish physical power. And so if we look in the 27th chapter, imagine this. Nebuchadnezzar's army has now invaded Judea and has surrounded Jerusalem. In fact, the army has already sort of broken through and has taken away a series of the nobles of the Israelites and has already carted them off to Babylon. And the folks who are left is this sort of plucky group of rebels who are trying to figure out, do we keep fighting or do we give up? And so Jeremiah in chapter 27 comes in the picture. He says, "Thus says the Lord says to me, make for yourself thongs and bars of a yoke and put them on your neck, and send them to the king of Edom, to the king of Moab, the king of the Ammonites, the king of Tyre, the king of Sidon, by envoys who have come to King Zedekiah of Judah in Jerusalem, and give them this charge to their masters. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, say this to your masters, it is I who made the earth, and the men and the beasts who are on the earth. By my great might and my outstretched arm, I give it to whomever I deem proper." So just in the beginning, Jeremiah is saying to make a bar into a yoke, put it on your back, and send your ambassadors out to these various different surrounding kingdoms around the state of Judea, around the kingdom of the Israelites. And the king is Zedekiah, right, who's in Judah, in Jerusalem. And he says that when you send these ambassadors out holding these yokes, it is God who made the earth, all of the people, the beasts who are on the earth, and it's God's great strength, the outstretched arm, the same one that brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, who controls the entire world and gives power to whomever God deems proper. And then he says this, and this is Jeremiah speaking to the court and to the king. I herewith deliver all these lands to my servant, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. I even give him the wild beasts to serve him. All nations shall serve him, his son and his grandson, until the turn of his own land comes, when many nations and great kings shall subjugate him. The nation or kingdom that does not serve him, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and does not put his neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation I will visit, declares the Lord, with sword, famine, and pestilence until I've destroyed it by his hands. As for you, give no heed to your prophets, your augurs, your dreamers, your diviners, and your sorcerers who say to you, do not serve the king of Babylon, for they prophesy falsely to you, with the result that you shall be banished from your land. I will drive you out, and you shall perish. But the nation that puts its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serves him will be left by me on its own soil, declares the Lord, to till and dwell on it. Okay, so what is Jeremiah prophesizing to the king? God is the powerful one who has entrusted God's power not to the king of Judea, not to the prophet, not to the high priest, but to the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the big bad guy himself. And what is Jeremiah trying to say to the king of Zedekiah? Is he saying, we are about to take a step out of history. The temple is falling, the kingdom is falling, and I, God, have ordained this. Now, it's an amazing rhetorical feat. But think about it this way. Jeremiah knows what's coming. He knows there's no other resolution to this than surrender. And so I love this, is that he puts the power not in the king of Babylon himself, but into God's hands. And that the enemy of Israel has actually become the tool of the God of Israel. And it created an entire theology that in some ways have blamed ourselves for our own exile. And it also puts the power of the oppressor in the hands of our own God, which does two, as I said, does two amazing and in some ways tragic and difficult things. Firstly, it allows us to have some comfort that God is behind this terrible tragedy. And that might not feel good to us as modern Jews, but maybe it's a way of creating a framework that allows the newly exiled Jews from Judea a sense that they still have a connection to God. And on the other hand, the questions of, well, then why would God allow us to go into exile becomes the ever-present question. And now this is not a class on theology, so we're not going to drill down on either of those questions too much, but I just want to point out that Jeremiah was one of the first who twisted the power dynamic and to take it away from the armies of men and to put it in the hands of God, which is both a palliative and pastoral move, but also a really traumatic and tragic move. The other thing that it says that Jeremiah has done here very eloquently is to say that power doesn't necessarily reside in the hands of those who you think are powerful. For the first time in history, a prophet is saying what is powerful is not the spear or the army or the person who wields it. What's powerful is the God who moves behind everything else. Which means that if you can take God with you to Babylon, which he does, he writes a letter to the exiles in Babylon and saying to purchase land and to have wives and to have children there, that if you can take God with you, then maybe God will also bring you back. Now you could imagine though that the king, when he hears this, like what's the response? What's a response when a king hears a prophet saying your kingdom is about to be ripped out from under you? So here in chapter 26 now, this is what happens. The priests and the prophets and all the people heard Jeremiah speaking these words in the house of the Lord, right? In the temple, right? the prophet is speaking. And when Jeremiah finished speaking all that the Lord has commanded him to speak to the people, the priests and the prophets, and the people seized him, shouting, "You shall die. How dare you prophesy in the name of the Lord that his house shall become like Shiloh and his city being desolate without inhabitants?" And all the people crowded around Jeremiah in the house of the Lord. They arrested him. And they threw him in prison. And that's because they weren't ready to hear what he had already seen coming. This disastrous exile that he had foresaw and saw in his heart and in the vision through God, he's trying to relate to the people to prepare for it, but they weren't ready to hear it. There are plenty of parallels throughout history when we get to tectonic shifts in culture, that there's going to be a small group of people who are going to try to envision what's next, and a group of people who are going to hold on to what was. And that clash you see playing out right here at the very end of Jewish hegemony in the Torah, or in the Tanakh. Those of you who have been in my prophets class know these texts and knows what happens at the end. When you get to the end of the book of Ezekiel or the book of 2 Kings, and it talks about the actual fall and the destruction and just seeing the kingdom fall apart. Jeremiah was preparing the people for that. In fact, the way Jeremiah writes, there's a whole strain of thought that Jeremiah was also the writer of the poems that we call Eicha, or Lamentations, because he was lamenting the destruction of the temple. So this was the end of Jewish history, or so we thought. This was the time when our sense of power, that in order to be powerful, you had to have an army and a state, that you had to have a social infrastructure and freedom of movement and freedom of commerce. This was the end of that model for us. And we could have disappeared. We could have totally disappeared. But Jeremiah, even though as hard as it is to read, Jeremiah and others prepared the Israelites for a different form of power that wasn't coercive. And there was a power of exile. And the exile, of course, put us in a double bind. And the book in the Tanakh that exhibits the double bind of exile, of course, is the book of Esther. Right? It is the book that takes place in exile. So I have a couple of excerpts from that to show you another model of where we move away from coercive power to something else. So this comes from chapter 2. Esther, as you know, is what we celebrate through Purim. We read the book of Esther. And on Esther, we learn about this place called Shushan, which is where Iran is today. And we learn about this wonderful family that saves the Jewish people. So some of our famous lines here. In the fortress of Shushan, there lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Shmini, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Yehoniah of Judea, and has been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So in chapter 2 of Esther, we already find one of the most important ideas that were brought with us into exile that kept us alive. It is namely our sense of history, internal Jewish history, not the history of Babylon, not the history of Iran or of Persia, not the history written by the Greeks or the Romans, our own sense of internal history sent through the line that leads from one generation to the next. Mordechai was the son of Yair, who was the son of Shmini, the son of Kish, who we can tie to the tribe of Benjamin. That's very important as part of our understanding of exile, of the dual identity that begins to develop when you're in exile. And you saw that Kish was exiled with that first group that went with Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. Now, here is where we introduce our main character. He was the foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was beautiful, shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. Okay, now here's a really interesting question. How many of you, what do you notice about Esther here? Number one, she is an orphan. Number two, she was adopted by her uncle, a Jew. And number three, and I think most importantly, she had two names. She had two names. So the fact that she's an orphan is, I think, a symbol of the sort of cutoff line that she had versus Mordecai, whose lineage goes all the way back to Benjamin. This is part of the double bind of being in exile, is that you can, if you don't have connection, you find yourself orphaned in exile. You don't have that sense of power or history. And then secondly, which I think is more important, is that she has two names. How many of you have two names? A Jewish name and a non-Jewish name. I just want you to think about that for a minute. How many of you carry more than one name? A name that you share the world with the world, and a name that you're called to the Torah. Having two names is part of what it means to live in a minority community and in exile. We know this from studies of people of color, people with different ethnic backgrounds to the majority background. There are names that they say to the general culture and names that they use amongst the in-group. And that's not just true of Jews, it's true of Latinos, Latinx, it's true of Asians, it's true of Persians, it's true of even African Americans and how they relate to each other versus their white person name. We call this, in sociological speak today, code switching. That you use a different type of language that's an in language versus an out language. And it doesn't have to be a full language like Yiddish or Farsi or Spanish. And in language are all the shortcuts, all the jargon that you use with each other. Even folks who don't speak Yiddish, who are Jewish and are raised in Jewish homes, still have sort of they speak Jewish to each other in a way that isn't maybe a foreign language, but uses all sorts of monikers that we don't use with the wider culture, right? Like when we talk about Shavuot, right? Who the heck knows what Shavuot is unless you're in the in-group? I can go on and on. But so the idea that Esther herself has two names is one of the double binds of being in exile. And it's what people do to regain power when they don't have power. I want to look at it through the frame of what it means to have power, right? The in-group, even a minority in-group, that is a sense of reserving power for yourself in a world where you don't have power. You don't have a police force and an army. What you do have is a language, shortcuts, maybe a culinary palate, sense of being together, sense of shared past and shared destiny, as you see in chapter 2. It's a different form of power. It's not something that is a power over. You can't overcome the majority community, but it certainly doesn't let them conquer you again and again, generation to generation. And so we'll be able to maintain. Now, the chapter 4 is how we deal in a classical exile sense of what it means to be powerless in a world that we don't have power. Chapter 4 is the turning point in the book of Esther. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. This is where Mordecai was coming to tell her what Haman was going to do with all the Jews, and he's going to Esther to try to do something about it, right? So he sends word to the palace. He's wearing like sackcloth and dirt and ashes, as you'll find out. And of course, he doesn't go to Ahasuerus himself. He goes to Esther, his beloved, but also a fellow Jew, in order to try to influence the king. And the queen was greatly agitated. So she sent clothing to Mordecai to wear so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he refused. Thereupon Esther and Samran Hattach, one of the eunuchs from the king, had appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn the way and where of it all. Hattach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the palace gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and all the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Esther is an amazing character because here she is. She's not ready to hear it. She has become subsumed as Esther has covered over her Jewishness And when she hears that her foster father is upset and wants to talk to her, what's the first thing that she tries to do? She tries to send him new clothes to wear. Don't wear sackcloth. Don't do that. That's what Jews wear when they're sad. Don't do that. Here's some silk garb from the palace, right? Hide yourself. And Mordecai refused. That itself was a power move on his part and on her part. She's trying to assert the power of diaspora, and he's trying to assert the power of the in-group, the power of the sort of like rhetorical power that he has to try to influence the outcome. And she can't actually deal with it. Like, she actually doesn't meet with Mordecai. She sends her eunuch, right? Her guard, her eunuch, her desexualized man down there to talk about it. And Mordecai talks to him because she won't talk to him. And only then does Chatach go up and relate it to Esther. And that is what begins to change the story. Only at that moment does Esther then think about it, fast about it. And then finally, Mordecai says to Esther, if you don't help us, maybe help will come from somewhere else. Literally says that, right? Which is a way of, like, when you think about that power dynamic, it's almost as if Mordecai is saying the physical power that we're trying to use at this moment, this political power, is a secondary power to the power of God again. And that was a lot of the exile thinking, is that politics and influence was meant to serve a purpose beyond politics. The politics of the moment are meant to be manipulated so that our will, or the will of God, can eventually be brought, in this case, in terms of saving the Jews. And that's a very interesting power dynamic between the in-group of the minority trying to use the out-group of the larger political system in order to save itself. And we know that we have found ourselves in that place over and over and over again. Think about all of the stories in the history of our exile, where we said, if only we assimilated, if only we became the vizier or the merchant leader, whatever we were able to do, or whatever we were able to achieve, whatever we were able to rise in the ranks, we're never going to become the king or the landowners or the people who run the country. But the best thing that we can do is use influence to try to save the Jewish people, or at least create prosperity for the Jewish people. And of course, it plays out in this almost comical way in the book of Esther, but it is the sine qua non of the exile understanding of Jewish power. When we don't have a state, we have to rely on influence. And here Mordecai is trying to influence Esther, and Esther is trying to influence the king. And we know how that turns out. Wrong holiday for us to study this for too long. So it's just, how this turns out. Now, I want to show out what the rabbis do with this text, because remember, this text, the Esther text, is in the Bible, and in the Midrash, hundreds of years later, we're still in exile. And so they play out this really interesting sort of, it's almost like a Animal Farm kind of way of looking at what power is supposed to mean. So here they're taking it from chapter 7. After these things, King Ahasuerus raised up Haman in chapter 3. And what we see is that what the rabbis do with it is just quite fascinating. It says, as it's written, the wicked will perish like the fat of the lambs, from Book of Psalms. That is, the evil ones were only created not for their own goodness, but for their own destruction. It's a strange comment. Similarly, Haman, the evil one, was only raised up so that he can be made low. That's really interesting. The evil people in the world who want to see our destruction are only raised up so we can take them down eventually. And then they tell this ridiculous and amazing parable. It says, a parable. A man had a filly, a little horse, a donkey, and a pig. And he gave the pig food without measure, and to the donkey and to the filly he gave with measure, meaning only a little bit. And the filly said to the donkey, so this little horse is saying to the donkey, what is the master doing? We are the ones who are doing all the work for the master of the house, and he gives us only measured food. But for the sorry, the autocorrect didn't work on this, but for the pig, he gives without any measure. The donkey replied, the hour will come, and you will see how she is laid low. For he only feeds her more than her weight, or for her honor, the word is kavod there, because of her wickedness. And when the winter solstice came, they immediately hung and slaughtered and butchered the pig. Then they began to give the barley to the daughter of the donkey, and she didn't want to eat it out of fear, because she thought maybe that's what's going to happen to me. And the mother said, my daughter, it was not the dish that caused this, it was the slaughterer. For it was written, and he placed his Mordechai throne over all the ministers that were with him, and thus they hung Haman. This is our version of the animal farm. You've got a little horse and a donkey and a pig. The pig gets fat, right? Why? And then the donkey and the filly, who are beasts of burden, are wondering why they have to work so hard, and this pig gets fat. And then come the winter, the pig is slaughtered. So the filly and the donkey then are vindicated, right? And when the filly or the donkey has a baby, a daughter, and the farmer comes and it looks like maybe they're feeding the donkey's daughter a little extra food, of course you're going to be afraid of it, because maybe having a life that's too good today will only lead us to slaughter tomorrow. And of course, then they say, well, no, that's not the case. It's not the food that matters, it's the slaughterer. So what is this text saying about power? What is this text? Who is the filly or the donkey? It's the Jewish people. And who is the pig? It is the people who oppress us. And God might be feeding the people who oppress us way more than we feel like we're getting fed, but someday, they're going to be led to slaughter, and we're going to survive. That is the parable. That's the meaning of the parable. Now, here's the problem with that, right? All right, so that's one model. We don't have enough time to go through all the other models, but I just want to show you this. The second model is all we have to do is wait. All we have to do is wait, and the pig will get slaughtered, right? The third model, I guess, comes from the Talmud, and I don't want to go through all the lines of text, but basically, this one says, ignore the outer world. This is the text that says, the outer world is for nothing. The Romans occupied the land of Israel, and at that moment when the Romans, this is now the fall of the Second Temple, they were deciding how we were going to be. And very similar to the text in Jeremiah, this text about the internal discussions of the Jewish people, that there was a group of zealots inside the city of Jerusalem who wanted to stick out to the bitter end. And then there was Rabbi Yochanan who said, no, let's escape and establish ourselves in this place called Yavna. And I don't have time to go through all this because I want to get to the modern texts. But essentially, he meets Vespasian. Vespasian becomes the emperor of Rome. And what happens is that now solidified in the year 70, we step out of history altogether. That we become a nation unto ourselves, but not a nation that has physical power. It has the power of Torah, the power of relationships, and eventually the power of political influence. And that's how we lived for thousands of years, until the 19th century. Right? In 1815, we were emancipated by Napoleon. It was the first time that the Europeans allowed us to become just like everyone else. Although if you study the letter of Napoleon to his brother about emancipation, the purpose of emancipation was not to make us free, but was in the hopes that by becoming free, we would disappear. That the letter that Napoleon writes to his brother says that if I allow them to become fully French citizens, they will have access to our culture, they will have access to our kingdom, they'll have access to the marketplaces, and eventually they'll put themselves out of business and they'll become French people, not these other people called Jews. And in 1815, we were emancipated, And of course, 50 something years later, French man named Dreyfus was serving in the French army, and something went awry, and they blamed him through anti-Semitism, and pulled him out in front of the rest of his troop, demoted him, and kicked him out of the military, arrested him, and punished him. And a young man named Theodore Herzl was a reporter at that time and was covering the story. And the most important thing that he learned from that is that after a very long exile away from our physical power, this idea of exile power, of using our influence, and then eventually this idea of modernity, trying to turn over everything that had come before, has led to nothing. Right? He writes in his book, The Jewish State, he says, "We are a people, one people. We've honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain, we are loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers, and often by those whose ancestors we were not domiciled in the land where Jews had already had experience of suffering. The majority may decide which are the strangers, for this, as indeed every point which arises in the relations between nations, is a question of might. I do not here surrender any portion of our prescriptive right when I make this statement merely in my own name as an individual. In the world as it is now, is and for an indefinite period will probably remain, might precedes right. It is useless, therefore, for us to be loyal patriots, as were the Huguenots who were forced to emigrate. If we could only be left in peace, but I think we shall not be left in peace. Can we hope for better days? Can we possess our souls in patience? Can we wait in pious resignation till the princes and peoples of this earth are more merciful and disposed towards us? I say that we cannot hope for a change in the current of feeling, and why not? Even if we were as near to the hearts of the princes as are their other subjects, they could not protect us. They would only feel popular hatred by showing us too much favor. And by too much, I really mean less than is claimed as right by every ordinary citizen or by every race. The nations in whose midst Jews live are all either covertly or openly anti-Semitic." In these opening words from the book, The Jewish State, gives birth to an idea that had been underground and latent in the Jewish consciousness, that modernity itself and the long exile out of Babylon and eventually to Rome leads us to nowhere, and that what we need is our own place to call home, a place to return to history, a force, an army, a nation that allows us to assert ourselves and to be free. These texts and others by Otto and a few others became the basis of what we call today Zionism, and led eventually to the building of the State of Israel. And in that moment in 1948, when we read aloud the Declaration of Independence and voted to become an independent state, for the first time in 2,000 years, we stepped back into history. We stepped back into a version of power that we had not known for nearly 2 millennia. And now, almost 80 years later, one of the questions that arises for me when we think about it is the generation that I grew up in, a generation that wasn't alive in 1948, a generation that wasn't alive in 1967, a generation that wasn't alive in 1973, generation that was born during, near, or close to the beginning of the Lebanon War, was reared during the Intifada, maybe did our gap year as I did during the Second Intifada, and is now living with a thriving, powerful state of Israel. how are we to relate to the idea of Jewish power? Does it mean that because we have a state that we can no longer utilize or rely on the exile sense of power through politics and influence other than to support that state? Does it mean that now we have a state that we have the confidence to be a Jew here at home and in whatever way that we want because we know we have a place to go in case it ever gets too bad? Does it mean that we are first few generations in the history of the world that both has a place here at home in a wealthy diaspora and has a place at home halfway around the world in a historic homeland protected by our people and our army? What does that mean to have that kind of power? To have both types, relational and coercive, rhetorical and violent. Never before in the history of the Jewish people have we had both realities running simultaneously. And this is not a class that is meant to teach about Israeli-American Jewish relationship. It's not a political class. This is a class to just think about what does it mean to have both? And how do both feed each other or tear each other apart? I want to go back to one more midrash from Song of Songs that has to do with the book of Esther. Song of Songs is what we read on Passover. It's a wonderful book of love poetry. And there's this line in chapter 6. Before I was aware, she sent me in the most lavish of chariots. Rabbi Chia taught, this may be compared to a king's daughter who was gathering stray sheaves. So the king had a daughter that liked to go out to the field and gather stray sheaves. And because it's Shavuot, that line should trigger something in our mind. Ruth was the character in the Bible who gathered the stray sheaves when she arrived to the land of Canaan to Boaz's homestead. Gathering stray sheaves is not something that a princess should do. It is something that a pauper should do or does do. It is not something that is way below her station. So you have to ask the question, what was the daughter doing in the field gathering stray sheaves? And so imagine Ruth in this situation. The king passed by and recognized that she was his daughter. Of course, you have to ask the question, why didn't he recognize her? Why didn't he know that she was gone? But even so, the king passed by, recognized that she was his daughter, and so he sent his friend to take her and to seat her with him in his carriage. Her friends looked at her in astonishment. Her poor friends, her pauper friends, her friends that were out there gleaning, taking the peah and the shichacha and the lekesh, the gleanings from the origins of charity in our culture, right? Saying, yesterday you were gathering sheaves and today you sit in the carriage with the king. And she said to them, just as you are astonished at me, so I am astonished at myself. And she applied to her the verse, before I was aware, she sat me in the most lavish of chariots. This pauper princess found herself in the center of power and was totally surprised by it. And so similarly, when the Israelites were in Egypt, they had to work with bricks and mortar, and they were repulsive and contemptible in the eyes of the Egyptians. And when they became free, they were delivered and placed in the authority over the whole world. The nations were astonished and said, yesterday you were working with bricks and mortar, and today you've become free and rule over the whole world. And Israel said to them, just as you are astonished at us, so we are astonished at ourselves. And they applied to them the verse, before I was aware, she set me in the most lavish of chariots. So I want to stop the full teaching here and maybe go back to a conversation. What does that mean? Think about that last text. What is the attitude the rabbis are trying to bring in this conversation? What does that mean to think about the pauper princess who finds themselves suddenly powerful? And the nations are totally astonished by this, right? Imagine what Constantine would say if we had the state of Israel. Imagine what Frederick the Great would have said, or Alexander the Great, or the Tsar of Russia. Imagine what any of those kings would have said, knowing that we have a powerful army, access to the most powerful weapons, a thriving economy. And then how do the Jews, maybe those Esthers and Mordechais who were living in exile back then, how would they see us today? And what opportunities do we have, knowing that we have both a state at our back and a prosperity here in America? And so when we talk about Jewish power, it makes us uncomfortable. It made the rabbis uncomfortable because we don't know what we mean by power. We don't want to assert ourselves too much, but maybe we don't assert ourselves enough. And when I work with young new leaders, I ask them this question because these are folks who want to run for office. These are folks who want to become philanthropists. These are folks who want to become civic leaders. And I ask them, where is the line between their desire for civics and their Jewish identity? And how are they playing out this idea of Jewish power that is meant to be a positive force and not something that's just seen as a negative force? So I want to open it up. I got about 10 minutes left. Happy to take questions. I'll allow you to unmute yourself, but please re-mute yourself when you're done with your questions so that we don't hear you, eating your cheesecake. Oh, Debbie has a question. You typed it. We are still astonished, she says. We now worry about losing the power. The Shoah plays an unending power in our conversation. Absolutely. I mean, the Shoah is the best and most powerful example of what happens when we were in exile. In many ways, Theodor Herzl predicted the Shoah. Jeremiah, in some ways, predicted the Shoah. And so that is that's a fascinating question. And how many of us are operating out of that place still? And how long will that cast its shadow over us? And I'm not judging that. I'm just asking that as a question. Michael says, power brings responsibility. It's not enough to rule. It is more critical to rule with compassion. Yeah, it's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is as we now have both coercive power in the form of a police force and an army, and we have a state, and we have a very prosperous diaspora, can we do it differently? Can we do it differently than how we were treated? Can we, if you were the pauper princess who gets to sit in the chariot with the king, how do you wield your power? And how do we wield the power of influence in the diaspora and the power of coercion in the state of Israel in a way that feels right to us, not just in terms of might, but in terms of right? To flip the Herzl proverb on its head. Other questions?
Rabbi, so in the past couple of weeks, one of the number one things on Netflix has been unorthodox. And then also in the past couple of weeks, we've been seeing a lot in national news, particularly to like the mayor of New York has been yelling at the Haredi communities for gathering, for having minions, for going to mikvaot and doing all these things. When we're are we more powerful when we're apart or more powerful when we're apart?
That's a good question and well phrased, Matt. I appreciate the phrasing. The question was, so, I'm going to leave the unorthodox piece out of this, both because I'm not sure if everyone's seen it and I don't want to give it away, but also more importantly, the question of like, what is it that compels these Haredi Jews and others, whether they're Jews or even evangelical Christians, to flout the medical doctors so that they can have their religious service? And the answer is that they live in this world where they believe that the politics, the political structure, the health structure, public health structure is only the secondary structure to their lives. It's the background that can be tread upon, manipulated, etc. Because what's really important is God's will in your life. Is the ever-present, Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of heaven, and your relationship to fulfilling God's demands upon you and your body. And so that's more important than what even a Jewish doctor, let alone a secular doctor, would tell you. That the world out there, they live in this very Esther-oriented world. The world out there, we have two names. The outer world, which is a lesser world, and the inner world, which is a holy world. And if the outer world is telling us we can't have our inner world, well, I'm just going to rebel, like Judah, the Maccabee. I'm just going to rebel, like Esther and Mordecai. And that's our righteous endeavor. Now, those of us who don't agree with that, look upon that and feel that, especially if they're Jews who are doing that, feel a lot of shame in certain ways, or feel like we're completely separated from them, like they're not us, they're not really us, or feel like there is this really, it's really difficult. So that's where it's coming from, Matt. And this virus has hit us spiritually in every place. There are things we should only do when we are gathered in minyan. Judaism is an embodied religion. That's why mikvah is so important to some of us, right? What we eat, what we put on our bodies, both in terms of talit, tefillin, kippah, head coverings, the times. And so this virus has said you can't have Shabbat dinner with your family if you can't use electronics on Shabbat, right? You can't go to the mikvah, which means you can't be physically intimate with your partner because you believe in the reality of the cycle of the body. And so this virus has really attacked everything that they felt, and in some ways I feel, and I think others feel religiously, about who we are. And so it feels like a righteous rebellion to push back. That's where they're coming from. And then the other layer of this is that it feels anti-Semitic to try to go in with police cars and squads and arrest a rabbi because he's trying to daven. Feels really anti-Semitic. Certainly anti-Semitic to only point out that the religious Jews are the ones getting together when at the same time there's thousands of people in Central Park, right? So like that's, that is its own problem. But it feels anti-Semitic, and we're nervous about how we appear in the larger spectrum. Again, that's that nature of diaspora. You have the in-world and the out-world, and we're worried how the goyim see us. And so that's another part of this power dynamic. So Rabbi Bassin says, there's a difficulty in transitioning to having coercive power. We're not used to it. And so I think we have a reluctance to accept the responsibility that comes with it. It's easier to lean into the moral high ground of relational power. And then she asks, what do you think we need to do to better own the implications of coercive power? Well, the first thing I will say is, and I agree with you, I think the first thing is, look at that text from Esther Rabbah. The rabbis are completely astonished that the pauper princess ends up in the carriage, and we should be astonished that we've made it. It's like the dog who caught the mailman, who caught the mail truck. Like the parable goes is that a dog chases the mail truck down the street but never catches up to it. What would a dog do if a dog caught the truck? That's the question. That's the astonishment that I think we're in. And the part that, without getting too political, I do think that we have certain responsibilities not to become like nations that ruled over us. And in many ways, the state of Israel has succeeded in that. And in many ways, we're still continuing to be very challenged in that. And I don't want to make this too political of a conversation, but if you understand, if folks both here and over there understand these balances, we could maybe come to a better place. This is the last question because I have to go soon. It says, do we have any positive examples from Tanakh when we wielded coercive power ethically? Is the coercive power we have had over our own Jewish communities, at least halakhically, a form of power you haven't yet spoken about tonight at all applicable national courts? Yeah, okay, so there are plenty of examples. They might not feel good to us in the sense that, thank you for the question, by the way, because culture has changed. But if you look at, just to give you an example, ideas that, it's a bad example, but it's the one I can think off the top of my head. If you decide to come upon a woman in a city that you're sieging and you want to have sex with her, you have to marry her. Now, that's a crazy thing to talk about in postmodern times, but you're talking about that, 5,000 years ago. The idea is that she garnered rights. Or the last story in the book of Bamidbar, where the daughters of Tzlevachad successfully uses their influential power to convince Moses to use coercive power to give women land rights, which didn't exist in the first 3.5, almost 4 books of the Torah. So that's another example. The Masechet Ketubot in the Talmud is an entire ketubah that's dedicated to protecting women's rights in marriage. Although we might disagree with what the conclusions they came to now, but I don't always want to hold where we've decided as a community now to the same standards that they held 2,000 years ago, which is why I believe in an evolving halakha, and why halakha has to change over time to wrap around the actual Jews who live here, living out Judaism today. So, the ketubah is a good example of that, although, modern ketubot are trying to grapple with ever-evolving understanding of those relationships. Other times, yeah, there are other times. There are times in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges where wielding power had to come with specific responsibilities. 36 times it says over and over again in the Torah that we should watch out for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, because we were strangers, widows, and orphans. So there are examples, and I'm sure if I sat down and had an hour to prepare for just that question, I could probably teach an entire class on it. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. So what I tried to do here tonight is to try to show you the history of Jewish power and why we're a little uncomfortable with it, is because we began in this place thousands of years ago where we had a coercive state. We had coercive power. We lost it, but we came up with another way of being powerful, which was to think theologically, to engage in the wider community while maintaining a minority status, an active minority status, using relational and influential power to try to protect and prosper the Jewish people. And then as history began to change, you saw how what that led to in terms of modernity and the Shoah, which meant we had to return to this idea of coercive power in 1948, before, but ultimately 1948. And now that we live with a thriving state of Israel and we have a thriving diaspora in America, at least, we have opportunities to play with both forms of these power, even though it can make us uncomfortable. The idea that we have an army can make us uncomfortable, and the idea that we don't have an army can also make us uncomfortable, which is why I think we should talk about these ideas more openly as a Jewish community, because I think we'll get better at both over time. So I want to thank everyone for coming, for being in my class tonight. And if you want to learn more, you can always come to the Valley Beth Shalom. I teach Pirkei Avot every Tuesday night. I have a Sunday Shmooze every Sunday morning. And I am so glad that I think Rabbi Hoffman has checked in. So I do want to pass the baton to him so that he can begin his class. And I just want to thank everyone for being here. And to Sarah Basson, I want to wish you Sha'ah Tovah. And I will share the text. I'll be happy to do that. So Chag Sameach.